Hello and welcome to the Decarbonise Week panel on the topic of a sustainable ocean economy. My name is Rayner and it's my privilege to serve as the moderator for this discussion. We have three excellent panelists here with us today. Before I introduce them and ask each of them to give their perspectives on this very important topic, I would like to say a few words of introduction. Let's start with, what do we really mean by a sustainable ocean economy? I would suggest we mean balancing the economic use of the ocean and ocean resources with the protection of the natural assets and ecosystem services that the ocean provides. This balanced use of the ocean is embodied in the concept of the blue economy, the promotion of economic growth, social inclusion, and the preservation of lives and livelihoods, while ensuring environmental sustainability of the ocean and coastal areas. In short, it's delivering the ocean components of the Sustainable Development Goals. The imperative to deliver this sustainable use of the wealth of the ocean has never been more pressing. Hundreds of millions of people depend on the ocean for their food and livelihoods. We all depend on the ocean for much of the oxygen that we breathe and for their controlling and moderating role in weather and climate. And yet the ocean faces a growing range of threats, from overexploitation, pollution, declining biodiversity, and most pressing of all, climate change. If we are to sustainably deliver the potential of the ocean for provision of food, energy, and natural resources, while protecting the ocean environment and the ecosystem services upon which we all depend, our use of the ocean must change profoundly. We're already seeing this transition taking place, and we anxiously await the outcomes from COP26 and an acceleration of that pace of change and a transition to massive use of offshore renewable energy, large-scale aquaculture, the creation of huge ocean protected areas, and the enhancement of the ocean as a carbon sink. All of these changes are set to massively increase the demand for data, information, and knowledge about the ocean. It is this knowledge-based new blue economy, looking to the sea for data and information to address societal challenges and inspire their solutions, that will be central to our discussion today. To provide context for our discussion, I would ask the first of our panelists to give his perspective on the path to a sustainable ocean economy. Thorsten Kiefer is Executive Secretary of JPI Oceans. The Ocean Programming Initiative, Healthy and Productive Seas and Oceans, was established in 2011 as an intergovernmental platform open to all EU member states and associated countries who invest in marine and maritime research. Before joining JPI Oceans, Thorsten was at Future Earth as director of their global hub in Paris, working with researchers and innovators on the big societal challenge of transitioning the world to global sustainability. His research background is in the analysis of deep sea sediments to understand the changes in the ocean and climate over the past thousands to tens of thousands of years. Over to you, Thorsten.
Thank you very much, Rolf. It is indeed an honor for me to be part of this panel. It is a composition that which is not my daily business usually. So you do see my slides, I suppose?
Yes.
Okay, good. Yes, so I'm from JPI Oceans, as Rolf has just introduced, and JPI Oceans, JPI means Joint Programming Initiative, and Oceans is just short for Healthy and Productive Seas and Oceans. I'll also tell you a little bit about Horizon Europe partnership, a new one in the making on sustainable blue economy. So on JPI Oceans first, so I think it is important that you understand in which area of stakeholders I am, which is my world, and how we can contribute to the transformation or to the transition to a sustainable blue economy or sustainable ocean economy. So JPI Oceans is an intergovernmental organization. Members are countries represented in our management board by ministries and funding agencies, and the European Commission is also associated with it. So this constellation, and on the map here you see which countries are engaged. This constellation means that there's a proximity to the policy landscape. The agenda of JP Oceans is driven by the country's needs to respond to directives or to fulfill policies that help people and economy to flourish. So this is not blue skies research innovation, it's policy driven. It also offers the possibility so that any results that come out of our activities, that they actually feed back into informing policy. So that is an idea. And our vision is to enable the transformation towards a sustainable blue economy whilst fostering the health and productivity of seas and oceans. And that's probably the mantra of this session, also to see the two sides of the same medal. We want the ocean to be productive and to build an economy on it. But at the same time, we rely on the resources, on the goods and services, and so on. So we have to protect that as we do economic activity. What is JP Oceans doing exactly? Well, or roughly, let's say, it is about aligning priorities. So we have many countries in Europe. Priorities do align sometimes, and if they align critically, then countries can agree to pursue a topic jointly, pooling or combining resources, and therefore have a stronger impact. So the next one is then to implement an agenda, to do something, such as a joint call for research innovation, or establishing an expert group to produce something, and finally, and that's important actually, is to impact somehow decision making, and that's the hardest part in a way. To give you an idea of the topics that are covered in JP Oceans, it is, for example, I highlighted in orange the maybe more important one for this group here. Ecological impacts of deep sea mining, munition in the sea as a big one, so to clear the munition from the seafloor to allow economic activity. Something on developing marine technology, or in particular the blue bioeconomy, including biotechnology. Underwater noise in the marine environment is a new topic of high interest, and in general, signs that can allow countries to go towards good environmental status, very broad thing. This gives you an idea of how much money is typically mobilized if a topic is addressed jointly between countries in a joint call. It's in the order of some millions to 10, 15, maybe if the European Commission is included, then 20 or so. The strategy scope of JP Oceans recently revised is again this about ocean health and ocean productivity, plus some ocean stewardship and governance, providing the scope of JP Oceans, and then there's topics that can be addressed within that scope. I'll not go into the details, just flick through the topics that are currently identified as pressing. Maybe also the context of JP Oceans is that of as I said, the policy context at the European scale. There are other joint programming initiatives, but there's also a close connection to the European Union and the European Commission. The European Green Deal is a big topic. Horizon Europe, the new framework program for the next 7 years. At the global scale, G7 is an important address, and the United Nations Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development. And then we also have regional connections. The European Partnership, a climate neutral, sustainable and productive blue economy, is maybe the most interesting for us in the context of what I said, this new Horizon Europe program for research and innovation for the next 7 years. And it's also spot on to the topic of this panel. The Green Deal, the European Green Deal, has been the kind of the North Star, or the guiding star, for the last couple of years for everyone dealing with European policy. This idea of really transforming the European economy to a sustainable and climate neutral state. with all these associated challenges of biodiversity loss, climate change, COVID recovery, digitization, and so on. So this is the larger context. And if I just now go to a figure of a schematic figure of what this partnership we designed a year ago, so what this partnership could achieve, I just referred to you to the bottom left. In a nutshell, this partnership might be the blue arm of the Green Deal. So the Green Deal is everything, and here is a partnership that aims to take care of the transition also of the blue economy. Okay, so this is a little figure that shows the regional connection, the separation into regional sea basins, or not the separation, but the reference to regional sea basins where countries and research and innovation organizations are organized also at a regional scale, which is very helpful. Quickly on the partnership, very high level structure is a pillar structure. That's why I'm giving you here 4 nice pillars. So the pillars are here in the 1, 2, 3, 4 things. The really high level structure is that one pillar being on a blue economy in harmony with nature. The second one on blue economy solutions towards climate neutrality. The third one, a thriving economy, blue economy for the people, and the fourth one on integrated governance, ocean governance topics. And then there's a whole array of cross-cutting topics to be addressed. Maybe quickly, the last slide, I believe, is the overall context of my world, our world here. If we go back, so this is JP Oceans, so kind of the scope we have defined, and then there is in the one hemisphere, you could say, the blue economy partnership, everything that has a perspective on the blue economy. On the other hand, then JP Oceans also covers this idea of ecological health in this other hemisphere. And both hemispheres are covered by very large processes, one being the European Green Deal, coming more from an economic side, and the other may be covered by the United Nations in its decade for ocean science related to the Sustainable Development Goals, covering the ecological perspective. There's also a temporal complementarity between JP Oceans and the Blue Economy Partnership, and also complementarities on leverage potential and implementation strength. But that's maybe too much detail for now, so I'll finish here and hand over to you, Rolf. Thank you.
Thank you, Thorsten. Our next panelist is Hugh Garlick. Hugh is responsible for the National Oceanography Centre's business development strategy through NOC Innovations Limited, the trading subsidiary of the centre, providing marine tech science and technology data, information, products and facilities. Hugh's career has seen him work for large engineering organisations in a variety of commercial roles, including global aero engine maker Rolls-Royce, French-owned global technology company Safran, and materials engineering company Prax Air Surface Technologies. Over to you, Hugh, to give your perspective.
Brilliant, thank you. Thanks, Ralph. That's great. And hi, everyone. As Ralph said, I work at the National Oceanography Centre here in the UK. And our mission really is to make sense of the changing seas that we all depend on. And I really see this as a key ingredient in achieving that balanced use of the ocean that Ralph described earlier in his opening comments, that economic use, the resources and protection of the natural assets and the ecosystems that the oceans have. The National Oceanography Centre is first and foremost an ocean science research institute. And while increasing our scientific understanding of the oceans is vital in my view, in relation to a sustainable ocean economy, it's really only one of 4 critical elements that I believe will probably define the direction of our blue economy in the future. But even these need to be set against a much wider aspect, which really spans all academic disciplines, and is something that we probably need to get to the heart of. And for me, that's how we as a collective human race want to interact with our oceans. And such a challenging question like that probably can't be answered in this discussion, but I think we can start to break down that into some elements that we can probably tackle. And if we can gain clarity on some of those and consensus on those elements individually, whilst at the same time sort of navigating the tricky interdependence that they have with each other, then for me, that's a really good start to think about how we define a future sustainable blue or ocean economy. So let me pick up on 4 of these defining elements or driving forces that I think will shape the future of the blue economy. The first one that I've already mentioned, and of course is key for me, is scientific understanding. And that's really measuring the ocean to obtain data, and then taking that data to answer key scientific questions, which ultimately inform our understanding of the oceans and really equip us to make the most informed decisions possible about how we interact with it. The second one I see is technology. And this has got 2 elements. It's developing the technology to collect the ocean data for scientific purposes, but it's also the technology that will allow us to work in and with the ocean. And that's everything from air, ocean surface, subsurface, and all the array of digital tools and capability and the like. The third driving force or element that will inform the sustainable blue economy in the future is the societal needs and demands that we all have, and that's everything from public perception of how we should work with the ocean through to more practical things. The electrification, which is driving the need for certain metals, reduction of plastics, and of course the role of the ocean in carbon reduction on a global scale. So there's both practical and perception-based needs that will drive how we interact with the ocean. And the final piece of the jigsaw that I see is the political will and agenda. And I'm not going to discuss this in too much detail, but for me, this covers everything from different organizational government investment policies, the regulation about how we work in and with the ocean, and of course the defense sector as well, and political wills and agendas around that in relation to how we interact with the ocean. I think we need to be realistic with ourselves when we think about what sustainability in relation to the blue economy means as well. And we really need to accept that we're simply not going to be able to perfectly align each of those 4 drivers on a global scale, that is, across the different nations' motivations, to drive a really fully coordinated approach to building a sustainable blue economy. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't stop being ambitious and try to have a coordinated approach on a global scale. And as an absolute minimum, we should really be working to match each of those 4 elements that I described, such that one doesn't conflict or hamper with the other one or with other ones. Because if any of those become too misaligned with the others, then we've got a real problem as I see it. And we're starting to see this. So, for example, the rate of technological change in areas such as autonomy and autonomous vessels, autonomous and robotic technology more generally, is far outpacing the future skill sets that we need from a people perspective to interact, develop and work with this technology. So we may end up in a position where we don't take full advantage of what autonomous technology can do because we don't have the depth and the scale of skills to use it, or those skills reside with the few people when they really need to reside with the many. And another example would be the political will to build an infrastructure that drives investment into the right areas that allow technology development to flow easily from this scientific use to much more widespread use in a future blue economy. There seems to be some misalignment between government investment and the technology element that I see. Great that we've got investment to develop technology for scientific research and blue sky thinking, but it also needs to push that technology right through the TRL process to the point where it can have much more wider use, and it has a broader role in the future blue economy, and a sustainable role at that. So acknowledging that this perfect alignment between these four drivers may not be possible, but always working to achieve it is critical. But unfortunately, this task doesn't reside with one person or one organization. As it's a challenge of this scale, they rarely do. But rather than thinking about how our own work or interests serve the immediate customer or stakeholder and solving that problem, I'd like to see us challenge ourselves a little bit more by continually sort of asking two questions in relation to this. And they're really simple ones for me, but it's that continual asking that I think will move things forward and try and drive greater alignment between these elements. The first one is, how does what I'm working on now contribute to the much wider goal of a sustainable ocean economy, both short term and long term? It's very, very easy to get wrapped up in the here and now and what I'm working on, but how does that relate to a much wider goal of a sustainable ocean economy? And the second one is, how am I going to put my work, my invention, my technology, passion, my voice, or my expertise to work beyond the obvious thing that it serves a purpose for within this context of a future sustainable blue economy? So in other words, how else could it be used to contribute beyond the obvious thing that it's been developed for? So from my world, I challenge the research community to think about how translatable scientific understanding is, and look to try and give it a multitude of uses to as many audiences as possible, so that it can be used in as many ways as possible to contribute to a sustainable blue economy. And I'll leave it there and expand on that in any questions later on. So back to you, Ralph.
Thank you, Hugh, for a very thought-provoking introduction, which really brings up a few really key questions about how we make this happen. Our final panelist is Melanie Nadeau. Melanie is Chief Executive Officer of the Centre for Ocean Ventures and Entrepreneurship, or COVE, where her role is to align people, companies, and opportunities to foster innovation and drive ocean technology to market. Melanie has been involved in Canada's innovation community for over 20 years and is an expert in the commercialization of emerging technologies. An internationally recognized thought leader, she offers a global perspective and has been a notable expert for the International Energy Agency, the United Nations Environment Programme, and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Over to you, Melanie, to give your perspective.
Great. Thank you very much, Ralph, for that lovely introduction. I'm going to share slides here. So let me go to... Excellent. Right. So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak this morning. I want to share a few thoughts around the topic around sustainable blue economy, but also share what we do here at COVE, because I come from an industry background, and I think when we think about the sustainable blue economy and how we're going to make progress in that space, there's a real need to change the way that we work, the way that we think about things, the way that we apply ourselves. And I agree with Hugh on, we've got to challenge the researchers, we've got to challenge people in industry to be thinking about what they're doing and how it applies to the bigger picture around the sustainable blue economy. So COVE, just to give you a sense of our mission, we're really focused on the commercialization of sustainable solutions for the blue economy. So that really means we're very focused on getting new products and services to market a lot quicker. And I mean, why do we care about the sustainability of the ocean? It's a significant resource. Of course, we know I'm located myself here on the east coast of Canada. In Canada, our geography lends itself to be surrounded by the ocean. And so it's a significant resource, not only from an economic opportunity from people who live very close to that resource, and then much larger at a global scale. Over 80% of global trade is carried by the sea. So it's an important transportation corridor. It's the largest carbon sink that we have today. So extremely important in how climate change will evolve and the health of the ocean, how that will play into that. A good portion of our protein comes from the ocean. So we're over 20% of the world's protein comes from the ocean. And in fact, when you think about aquaculture, it's one of the largest growers of protein within the ocean. And so on. So the health of the ocean is quite important to anything that we do. And across these sectors, so our focus is along these 5 verticals within the ocean sector. So defense, offshore renewable energy, marine transportation, fisheries and aquaculture, and marine tourism. And I think what's really important to understand, we work in, we're essentially a high-tech innovation hub that is developing different tech and working with different organizations and businesses to develop technology that really fit a lot along these 5 verticals. And the ocean is so interconnected. So when you think about marine transportation and the potential for decarbonization around marine transportation can have a significant effect on marine tourism. Same to be said, I did a lot of work in offshore renewable energy prior. And when you're looking at developing any field in the offshore space, it's so interconnected to what's happening in fisheries and how that plays a role into that type of development. So, and coastal area management. So it's very important to understand that the different sectors within the ocean, the blue economy, are so interconnected in many ways. And when we look at the high-tech innovation that is happening across these different verticals, there's so many different applications that carry over one to the other. For ourselves at Cove, the way that we work, we've got physical infrastructure that we have different facilities here that are collaboration space. We have waterfront and so on. So that's very important to be able to kind of bridge this new way of working and driving innovation at a much quicker pace, because if we're looking at addressing this challenge around the blue economy, working at it the way that we've been doing it and using the ocean in the way that we've been doing it, it's just no longer going to be acceptable. So we have to drive innovation much faster, and we have to, in my view, really have to do it in a more collaborative way. So working with the researchers that really understand different aspects of the ocean, and then working with industry who is developing products and looking at different tools on how we operate in the ocean is going to become more and more important. So we're very involved in building different networks and looking for business opportunities, and as well in people development, because, as was earlier mentioned, there's so much need for a skill set that understands the ocean, but the skill set that also understands things like data around the ocean. How do you manage that for different purposes, and how do you understand that? And as part of Cove, we're very involved on the entrepreneurial and ensuring that we foster innovation. We've got a fortunate position here with Cove that we're part of a very strong cluster of industry, so various levels of industry, including shipbuilding. One of the largest Canadian contracts in defense is being awarded just across the water from us to build new surface combatant ships for Canada. So that's a very important element of building the infrastructure and the people and the talent and the programming around new innovations. So that's definitely a big catalyst. And then, of course, there are other industries around here that are very instrumental into building the cluster. Very closely, we work with academia, and within this cluster, we've got the highest level of PhDs in Canada that are working in, or that have studied or doing some research within the ocean. So that's very important to the fabric. And same with, building this cluster. It's very important to have colleges like ourselves, very applied training, so that people are ready to go out and to go work in industry in different aspects of the ocean. So we work very closely with the community college. And of course, government has such a strong role. So, of the different industry sectors, government is a major player because they are a procurer of innovation, or they can be a procurer of innovation. So I always think, I've been very advocating that the government has a role in adopting new innovation because they are a customer of those products and services. So they can really be sort of first leader, front leader into adopting new innovations, and that help to accelerate the pace at which we're moving ahead with the blue economy. Just a snapshot of our facilities here. So we've got, working waterfronts, finger piers, different vessels that come through, and then this collaborative space that we have on site, and we tend to work a lot along the eastern seaboard and across the Atlantic. Again, very focused on those 5 verticals, but identifying technology, high-tech solutions that can work well amongst those. Our ecosystem. So this is quite important. What is your ecosystem? So our ecosystem is largely industry-based, but we have a lot of partnerships and connections to, whether it's different global hubs around the world, like-minded organizations, and different associations. But physically, what's really important in this new way of working is that we have 60 companies, from startups all the way to multinationals, that are resident within our facilities. So that's become very important in the collaborative way of how we've got to be thinking differently about things. So I have some great examples there, and in our networks span everything from we've got a 2,000 plus network, but it's venture capitalists, it's government leaders around the world that are very interested in trying to understand how we accelerate the pace at what we're building innovation around the sustainable blue economy. We have a variety of programs. We have 5 different programs, which I'm happy to answer any questions about. But these are really important programs that, from an industry point of view, we have heard, we have listened, and we are trying to address and working with industry on these, from developing a talent pipeline to, on the technical side, building the right infrastructure that allows that commercialization piece to happen. So, when I talk about high-tech innovation, I think about underwater acoustics, sensing, imaging, marine communication and navigation, wireless networks and sensor, robotics and autonomous vehicles, informatics and artificial intelligence, and so on. So we're highly focused on what is the type of infrastructure, commercial infrastructure, that it can allow the pace of acceleration to happen, and do it in a way that's shared. So we work with different businesses around that. We're also very focused on, through our incubation space, to develop new ideas, new technologies, new businesses through our startups, but also work on the acceleration of companies that are beyond the startup phase, but need to, are working to be established as a small and medium-sized enterprise, which is, in Canada, a very important part of our ocean tech community. So, over 90% of our ocean tech community is small, medium-sized businesses. So very important. And we work with institutes on research institutes and project by project basis, but how do you get that research into a commercial industrial space? So that's also very important. And lastly, as I mentioned, we like to work with like-minded organizations. And we've had, in this new way of working, we've had a lot of, in the brokering of business, a lot of great success stories amongst different companies, from decarbonization to new ways of looking at fish traceability in the fisheries sector. So that there's been a lot of progress there. And when we look at technologies and advances that we see here at COVE, it really ranges everything from looking at different coatings. So Graphite Innovation Technologies, the company that we work with, GIT, they just announced with a new graphene coating that they have, actually was announced earlier this week, that they can reduce emissions, GHG emissions, by 20% when they put this coating on board vessels. So, and that's been work in partnership with Lloyd's Register. So there's some really interesting advancements that are happening from a technology point of view. And the other piece that we're very focused, that I think is a really important conversation around the sustainable blue economy, is ocean observation, but it's also how we look at the ocean in a digital way. So, we operate buoys and different infrastructure that's about generating real-time data for different types of users. So users are commercial, so it's proving their operations, reducing risks. And then we also invite the research community and the startup community to look at how are we using this data for different applications. Is there's different ways that, whether it's industry, they can create new value adds in their businesses, or from a research point of view, how are we understanding big data and building predictive models around different operations within the ocean that can help to make operations more sustainable. And lastly, I just want to mention, when we talk about different types of infrastructure and how we work in this collaborative way, I do want to mention this multi-sensor seabed platform that we call the CelaMars that we built this year. And we've worked with 30 companies around this, but it's the concept around trying to get different tech to market and working together through a shared platform. And we have 16 different types of sensors that are on this platform that sit at the edge of our wharf. And it's used for testing, validation, demonstration, and also to understand, when you have a collective amount of data around this, what are those value-added opportunities that can help us to move the dial around the sustainable blue economy. So in essence, that's just a few words. I'm looking forward to the conversation and the discussion. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Melanie. Now we're going to move into the discussion part of today's proceedings. But before we do that, I see a few questions coming in from our audience. I would encourage you to post your questions because at the end of this panel discussion, we're going to open this to the audience and say, I see a few questions coming in, but please post your questions so that I can put them to our panelists. So I'm going to start the discussion around the whole issue of barriers to delivering a sustainable ocean economy. The transition we need to make is an enormous one, and we're just at the start of it, and we've got a relatively short period of time, particularly if you look at it from a climate perspective, to deliver that transition. So I'm going to ask each of our panelists for their thoughts on what do you see as the most pressing barriers to delivering a sustainable ocean economy, and maybe a couple of thoughts as to what needs to be done to overcome them. So where shall we start? Who would like to kick off with that question?
I'll go first if you like, Ralph. So let's be realistic. There's loads, right? I mean, that would be silly to say there's only a few. So I think we need to be careful that we're not trying to take on too much. So, regulation is an easy one to pick, but I think it's such a broad topic that we probably need to be a little bit more pointed. So for me, I think there's a real piece here around coordination of investment, but set against the backdrop of needing to recognize that people only want to collaborate when there's a real tangible output of use of whatever that collaboration is. And I think at the moment the investment that's provided for sort of technology or research development, it is not necessarily balanced particularly well between the research and the sort of practical use end of the scale. And that varies hugely by country as well. So some countries do it very well, others don't. But I think from my perspective, getting that balance of investment right such that you create a push of sort of coordinated technology from a research environment through to real world application and at scale, which is the key thing here, is one of the barriers. I mean, we're not particularly good at doing that, and I think for me that's a big one, especially sitting in a research institute where we benefit a lot from it, from investment in research, but it needs to have a scalable end goal.
Thank you for that. Would anyone else like to chip in on this question? Melanie.
Sure. Yeah. So I think there's a real need for collaboration and leadership around this one. So the government, so both from industry and government. So governments, set rules and regulations. So it's very important to kind of have that visionary path around how is a sustainable blue economy going to be hitting our climate change ambitions, and being very clear about that and putting measures in place to enable that to happen. So whether it's through regulation or whatnot. And I think the other piece that is not necessarily always clear on our understanding around the ocean. So sometimes we push development, or a government can push development to happen, but yet the regulatory piece is 10 years behind. And so that's very, very confusing from an industry point of view, and can have huge lags around delays in capital investment. And so there are often, we've seen in many projects that there's a disconnect between existing regulation and trying to advance new climate change measures, new innovations into the market. So think about marine electrification, for example, which is highly regulated marine transportation. Oftentimes the regulations are behind, and they're not necessarily understanding how you put different batteries aboard vessels and so on. So the acceleration around new regulation to enable innovation is very important. And then that leadership from government to identify the sustainable blue economy as part of our ambitions around climate change is very important. And I think also on the capital side, governments also play a role on de-risking investment, and that can happen through many different ways. I mean, we know that investments in the ocean are capital intensive. It is not an easy place to operate. It's a high risk environment. So having the government be involved in that early stage de-risking of tech development or industrial projects going ahead in the ocean is very important. And that can happen whether it's funding programs or de-risking programs, but it can also happen around government procurement for innovation, because again, the government is a big customer of ocean protection, development, and so on. And then really the private industry, I think, needs to continue to spearhead innovation. And they can take on some of those development risks, but the path needs to be clarified a little bit more. And so that together, I mean, it sounds straightforward, but it's very complex. It's really to drive that collaborative and that visionary leadership around how we want to accelerate the pace at what we're looking at for a sustainable blue economy.
So it's really about streamlining the innovation process and getting a proportionate use of resources along that chain of innovation, because I certainly see that there's too much concentration perhaps at one end of it, the research end of it, and too little effort going into how you take that out to delivering the sustainable ocean economy. I turn to Thorsten to add his comments.
Yeah, absolutely. And a little bit like you started, I mean, with this question, where to start, really. So I'll mention the knowledge that is still often insufficient to transform to a sustainable ocean economy. And yeah, so it's not, we know that we have to transform, but how, that is really the question. And maybe a little example from a recent discussion we had. So where we identified maybe the topic of noise pollution in the ocean being a serious one that has to be addressed, and also with a growing economic activity. And we want to know about what the effects are and how we can minimize the harmful impact and so on. So, and basically, so we had the discussion then, different countries around the table, and we had a discussion about these impulsive noises from geophysical exploration and from building and so on. And so there was agreement that it's maybe problematic, but actually we don't know yet what the ecological effects are. And one country then had concluded from that, okay, so if we don't know, then we have to stop everything. And they had very harsh measures in place. Another country with the same information, vague information, reacted and said, okay, so if you don't know, we just keep going as we do at the moment. So it's a typical example of insufficient knowledge how to guide economic development. And likewise, I mean, we are trying to get some more knowledge, for example, on the effects of deep sea mining. Another thing with these polymetallic nodules from the deep sea that can be a very nice resource for the electrification that we are going towards. But again, so it's what we don't want is to solve one problem by creating another one. We've done that often enough, and therefore there's this huge demand still of really basically scientific knowledge also.
And that's a wonderful segue into my next question. And this is turning to the other end of the process, and that's the data, information and knowledge that we need to underpin this transformation. Now, it seems to me we're moving from a world where we need much more emphasis on the data and knowledge that we need to manage the ocean than perhaps that we need on understanding the ocean. So I'm going to be a little provocative with that. I'm going to ask each of you now to comment on where you see the gaps in our ability to deliver the data, information and knowledge we need to affect this, to underpin and affect this transformation. Who would like to go first?
If no one else wants, I mean, I can. So from the discussions that I have around me, it seems the biggest deficiency is in actually biological observation or observation of the ecosystem health and so on. We are doing fairly okay with physical parameters of the ocean, even though there we can always ask for more. But when it comes to actually what we might call the ocean health, so the biological component, that is far underdeveloped. At the same time, though, that is also a huge opportunity because there are technologies developing where we would probably, if we put the resources towards it, we'll see a massive boost. One thing being the so-called environmental DNA, so where then basically DNA from a water sample or a sediment sample also can be analyzed and have an integrated then picture of everything that lives or lived there, providing huge data, very interesting data and comprehensive data of a whole ecosystem. And in that context, going a little further, this whole idea of omics, so a similar thing with genomics, proteomics, metabolomics, and whatever. So it is basically big data production of the biological system. It's quite at the horizon that this will be a huge opportunity, actually also economically, to make massive progress on our understanding and monitoring of the ocean.
Who would like to jump in next?
This is an interesting one because I think we're always going to want more data, and that's going to happen. It's going to need to happen, and various ocean variables, etc., etc. I think the interesting piece here is that data thread, though, from collection through to end use, and that for me is the bit that seems incredibly fragmented. So this delivery of data from source to practical application, and it's probably a question that in multiple industries everyone has been tussling with for many years, which is around how do you take this raw data and you make it possible to be used by as many people in an accessible way that is information that informs whatever they need to do. And that bit in the middle, that data lake, that layer, is the bit that needs to be addressed for me. And we've got the tools around us with, machine learning, et cetera, and a broad array of digital skills that exist in that space. But I think that the gap is understanding the scientific need or variable that needs to be measured, and translating that to a usable information outcome for as many people or as many organizations or needs as possible. And that data science bit, I'm not sure we've got the skill set. We don't know the skills that are needed, and we certainly don't have that at scale yet to be able to do that across the globe. So I think it's that thread, and that middle bit of that thread from raw data to usable information for a multitude of uses that is the big gap for us.
So perhaps the challenge is more of a systems engineering challenge than it is a scientific challenge.
I would say so. Yeah,
and maybe we might learn from some other communities that have solved that challenge more already. So that's perhaps a pointer. It is to think about how other people have picked up and solved that. Melanie, do you want to add anything to this discussion?
Sure. By observation, I think what we're seeing when we look at, a lot of the high-tech companies that are developing different applications to get ocean data, what's been traditionally seen in this sector is a focus on hardware and developing the hardware that will go in the sensor or whatnot that will go and monitor that ocean information. And that data is given to the client, to the customer. And the one who's developed the hardware, that relationship ends there. And there is, a huge undervalued opportunity around that data and the amalgamation of a series of data that the one who's developed the hardware has a potential access to. So we've got to be more open with the data that we collect. And I think from the developer point of view, developing the hardware, we've sort of lost sight of the value of data. And I think that's a transition that, industry is grappling with, because it's still a very new frontier, is how do you manage all this large data, and how do you utilize it in a way that can allow you to develop new opportunities, new business opportunities. So for example, what we're starting to see now, when you think of AUVs and underwater robotics, oftentimes it was a selling of robotics to the end customer. And then the end customer used the data set that came with the robotics. But now there's a shift, at least in business model, where it's becoming robotics as a service. And so the idea is that the developer of the robotics is now also able to contain the data and provide that as a long-term service instead of just selling the AUV. So that's a transition that's still early days, but there are models that are shifting. And then I think the other point that I wanted to raise on how the importance of data is impacting from an industry point of view is take fisheries, for example. So fisheries, unfortunately, there's a significant amount of waste, millions of tonnage of waste that's associated with fishing and the whole process management around fishing. And, when investors are looking at this go forward, they have a big role to play in how businesses are operating. So think about banks or ESG investors or whatnot. So the sustainability of certain businesses, when you look at, say, fisheries in certain instances, they can become underperforming assets, which is not, you wouldn't think of it as an asset, but it can be an underperforming asset where, investment capital access becomes a lot challenging to access. But through data and sensors, for example, we've seen tremendous amount of work on and new innovations that are coming up to reduce the amount of waste in the whole process of fisheries. And that is all happening through novel sensors, through getting access to data, to understanding along all the different points of that process up to packaging, how there can be improvements to reduce waste, to say reduce even GHGs, right? And improve catch. So I think data and different instruments to collect data are going to have significant impact in different processes through business. And fisheries is a really great example. And same with aquaculture. So aquaculture is growing at a pace that is pretty significant, but not without its challenges. So, there's disease and that. So the sustainability of aquaculture is quite important. And sensors and different instrumentation are allowing of operators to actually see immediately if there's an issue within their aquaculture units. So that's become very, very important, and to try to track whether it's different types of disease or different elements in the aquatic environment that would indicate that there may be a disease prone. So that is all coming through data, real-time data, and I think that's just an area that's going to continuously grow.
So it's a real transition to truly operational use. And that is all about that management process, because we're going to have to manage a significantly increased level of activity in the ocean. And if that's going to be sustainable, we've got to manage all the interactions between those different uses. And that's going to require a lot of operational information to achieve that. A couple of you have touched on technologies. We've heard mention of autonomy, and we've heard mention of eDNA and the whole developments in the genomics area. Any other thoughts on how emerging technologies might fill some of the gaps in our future needs for data and information?
I think. Oh, sorry. No, go ahead.
Sure. I think at a macro scale, what you see so I came from the energy industry. What you see in the energy, the macro trends, decarbonization, digitization, the ocean economy those are big trends that we're seeing in the ocean economy. So decarbonization, whether it's through offshore renewable energy, is going to grow at a significant pace. And those operations and how we do operations, so think of wind turbines, for example, offshore wind turbines. How are we using robotics to do survey work? How is the data being interpreted to do environmental assessments? How is I've seen everything from, using drones to look at blades on wind turbines, right? And interpreting if there's any maintenance concerns and whatnot. So there's going to be a big shift again around within the ocean economy on how we're able to use these enabling technologies to improve our information around the environment in a continuous way, improve our information around the operations of facilities like offshore wind and so on. So I think that's a big transition and really sits within the kind of that decarbonization route. And then the other one is transportation. Marine transportation is going to undergo a significant transition. And, and starting with looking at early stage technologies and how they decarbonize vessels, whether it's through electrification or different type of fuel uses. But even when you think of like large data now, so there are operators that are looking at data in a very different way to cut fuel costs, but also to reduce emissions. And that's largely driven by now the ability to think about data and see data in a very different way. So I think those are big transitions that are going to be happening.
And Hugh, you wanted to jump in on this one? Go ahead. Well, Melanie said a lot of what I was going to say. I couldn't agree more. I think the challenge with that is that it's not just one type of tech. There is a whole host, and that almost needs to be viewed as a supply chain of technology, because you cannot take advantage of one without another one developing at a similar rate. And that for me is the key piece in that. So it's acknowledging the fact that there are various technologies that are all going to have to be used and synchronized together, and be interlinked. So the use of digital twins, for example, for subsurface infrastructure work, that's only possible if you're using subsea robotics and autonomy. So they're so interlinked that they have to be developed in conjunction with each other to maximize the benefit that they can bring.
And Thorsten, do you have anything to add to this topic?
Yeah, I mean, I can, and yes, I mean, technology is everywhere, and I would say a major field going forward will be technology that enables the circular economy and in the ocean economy also. So if I was an investor, I would not put myself put my money into something that doesn't try to achieve circularity. So basically, taking one person's waste and taking that as a resource for another person. Yeah, and so you mentioned the digital twin, and so in here, my world of European policy, that's actually something that is, let's say, technology based, where a lot of hope is currently put towards basically enabling much better planning of economic activity and its impacts in this digital space. Also, then having a better sense of the risk of investments in ocean economy. Yeah, so that's maybe the number one keyword at the moment that is bouncing here off the walls, I feel.
Okay, well, that sort of takes us into the whole question of how can we accelerate innovation? Because if you look at the transition we've got to support, we don't have the capability at the moment to scale to a sufficient scale to be able to address the needs. So I take one example in offshore wind. If we proceed with implementation of offshore wind on the sort of scale that the IEA recognized in their net zero by 2050, right now we don't have the capacity to be able to underpin that pace of transition. So I want to turn back to that question of how do you accelerate innovation so that you can actually match the required rate of change in the ocean economy to a sustainable future in probably in the order of the next decade. So it's a pretty rapid pace. We've got to get on with this. Who would like to tackle that one? Accelerating innovation.
I can start, but I think my response is going to relate to my earlier comments. So, if we're moving at that pace, and we all agree that we need to move at that pace, or different countries are moving at that pace, you need to carve the path out to be able to do that. Because I think that carving the path is about setting the right regulation in place that allows the permitting at offshore wind, right? Should it take 6 years to permit a site for offshore wind, that's not going to get us to those kind of targets. So that involves data, information, but a lot of working together to have the right processes in place that enable that development to happen and enable that capital to be attributed to that kind of development without having a lot of, or there will always be risk with capital, but reducing the risks around that capital investment, I think, is important. And so there's definitely a clear path required. And I think that whole collaboration piece, that sometimes, we talk about collaboration way too much, but to move that pace of innovation, I think even big corporate entities are going to have to think about innovation in a not in silos, and they're going to have to be reaching out to some of the smaller companies that their pace is much quicker than a larger corporation who can move in a decade. But smaller companies can't afford that, right? So they're consistently innovating. So I think even for large companies, it's how do they get more innovative at a quicker pace. It's going to be a big area for them to be considering, to meet the mandates that are there, to be market leaders, to gain market share. It's going to be very important for them to be looking at innovation and trying to understand how they innovate at much quicker paces than I think that we'll probably have ever seen in a lot of the, quite frankly, a lot of the legacy industries that exist within the ocean economy.
So it's about the creation of innovation clusters. It's getting groups of organizations of different scales who can contribute to different parts of that innovation chain, but getting them together in a different way to perhaps the way we've done it in the past. We can't wait for the big companies to start buying all the small companies. They've got to work with them in a collaborative way to take great ideas and accelerate getting them into use. Who would like to add to that topic?
I just I take a slightly different view, I guess, on innovation, and I think we tend to think innovation means newer technology and better technology and digital and the like, and I think that's absolutely right that we do. But as Melanie pointed out earlier, that's a very hardware view of the world and innovation. I think the reality is, the engineering capability to solve some of these challenges that actually already exists. And then if you accept that, you then come down to the level and say, actually, we need to be innovative about all these little connections, how we connect this all together in a coordinated fashion. That for me is what the innovation piece is about, not the nuts and bolts of the engineering side anymore. And how we do that. The honest answer is I don't really know, but for me it's about it's got to be about that coordination point and putting a foundation or a fertile ground to allow this to flourish at pace. And one example Melanie's made already around reliance on smaller companies. What they're good at is a very, very niche technological thing, but they can do it very, very quickly, and that tends to be the opposite of what a big corporate is very, very good at. So recognizing that and being innovative about how you link that up to take advantage of both is the key thing.
I certainly couldn't agree more that the challenge is not the new ideas. Innovation isn't invention. Innovation is about taking ideas and connecting them to solving problems. And there is too much emphasis on there's thousands of ideas out there. It's how do you get those ideas to the point where they're actually effective in solving a specific problem? That's the harder part of the challenge. Anything to add from your side, Thorsten?
Yeah, I could add an entirely different angle, I believe, which is maybe more the soft elements of it. That investment into the ocean transition might often be limited by actually disregard of the ocean and ignorance and so on. So I mean, still the ocean is this kind of bluish surface where we don't know very much what's underneath. And so if you imagine where would you put your effort and your passion and also maybe your money and your innovative energy, then into something probably you know and you understand, and also where you have an emotional relation to. And therefore, two keywords that are kicked around are ocean literacy. So one thing as a first step to actually let people know about the ocean, about its value, about its ecosystems, about the beauty and all that. And that way then close what is often referred to as the emotional gap. So to care actually about the ocean and then see the value of this transition or transformation to a sustainable economy. So that means really going out there, trying to put educational material and campaigns and into whatever schools and other educational systems, and then that in the midterm, this will also hopefully have the positive effect of having more skilled workforce to actually carry the transformation.
Okay, I'm conscious of time, and I'm starting to see quite a few questions come in from the audience. So I'm going to use one of the audience questions really and couple it to the final question I was going to pose to our panelists, and that's about the workforce for the future. Several of you have touched on this already, and I have a question from Richard Semper, which is about what education, what type of education we need for tackling the sustainable ocean economy. So do you think we need to train a new generation of interdisciplinary managers by mixing oceanography, economics, law, etc.? So we have people with a rounded understanding of the issues. Is that one of the things that we can do to help to tackle, to provide the work we need for the future to effect this transition? So multidisciplinary training. Any thoughts on that?
Sure, I can jump in. We do a lot of work on workforce development, and the multidisciplinary nature, I think, of any type of economy is going to be very important, and especially when you're talking about innovation. It's not necessarily about the engineers in the room. It's about process control. It's about understanding the regulators. So I think that multidisciplinary approach or cross set of skill is very important for anyone. But what I want to touch on workforce, which to me is astounding, and it's a little bit, we talked about ocean literacy. So we've done some baseline work, and this would be in parts of Canada with youth. So when we're thinking about, what kind of skills, what kind of talent will we get there? When does it happen? I think, the education systems are at the post-secondary level. There's oceanographers, there's different skills. There's exposure now to entrepreneurship. So that multidisciplinary, at least what we're seeing is universities are seemingly starting to transition that so that students have different exposure to businesses or different types of opportunities. But one of the things that has astounded us, and we've done some baseline research on this several years ago, was that youth, when you talk to youth about, and youth is grade 4, so elementary kids, anywhere from, grade 7-year-olds onwards in high school. When we've talked to them and done our baseline studies around what do you see a career in the ocean look like? Well, our research showed that many of these kids saw it as a very dark, dirty industry place to work. So think about legacy industry like fisheries and offshore oil and gas and so on. So what that made us really realize was that we have to start changing the conversation around the ocean. And it starts really young because we know those kids are the ones through their parents, educating their parents, and teachers, but those kids start forming ideas around the ocean at a very young age, and that might direct where they're going to go in their career. And so we need more diversity in this sector. We need the different skill sets. So to me, that's fairly alarming, and we have to enable ocean literacy starting at very young age, but the whole sector, our teachers, our parents, et cetera, because we're going to need a much broader talent pool down the road. And, we can do the work now with our post-sec and our professionals, but, if we want down the road to have more talent that's very open to thinking differently about the ocean, it needs to start now.
Other thoughts on ensuring we have the workforce for the future?
Okay, I quickly, I would say the question of Richard is a good one, but certainly not a black or white answer. I'm sure that we actually need both the kind of really the specialists that work out cutting edge things, but also the generalists. And if I would say where do things go, then I would also agree with Melanie that it goes into the direction of really that demand for people with integrated thinking, and because this is also the solutions that we are looking for. For example, we were asking earlier the question how to scale up sustainable economic activity, and that is partly multiple use of limited ocean space. So we need people who can build concepts that do not only produce energy but also other uses in the same space. Also, it is a matter of really acceptance, and then maybe that comes this ocean literacy idea back into the game, acceptance by the population. So there needs even to be a bit of thinking among whatever the ocean economy workforce that it has the transformation has to happen socially just, let's say, taking on board the people and to gain this social license to operate in the blue space.
But of course, there are some practical challenges. Going back to what Melanie was saying, there are some practical challenges with taking this message out to younger children, because in many countries, certainly in the UK, we're locked into a pretty rigid curriculum for kids at school, and so you've got to influence that curriculum. You can't just go into schools and introduce this message. So there's a whole challenge there to think through and think about how we solve. Anything you want to add, Hugh, on this whole question of how do we get the skills we need in the future?
I think we just need to broaden our, well, two things. The first thing is we need to accept that we don't actually know. We can't account for everything. We don't know, quite frankly, for exactly what we're going to need, but we need to be comfortable with that as a concept. And I don't think we are as a human race, quite frankly. And certainly when you boil that down to curriculums and designing curriculums for future skills, we can't be comfortable with that because we need to know what they need to be to design a curriculum. So you end up in this spiral, but we need to accept that. The second thing for me is we also need to break away from our thinking that, you know, to work in ocean science, you need to be an ocean scientist or have done oceanography, or you don't. You really don't. You know, you could be a data scientist and you could work for Microsoft, but those skills are equally applicable for data science within an ocean science or an oceanography setting. So we certainly shouldn't constrain in any way the thought that, you know, certain disciplines lie better with certain industry sectors. They're equally transferable, and of course it comes back to not really knowing about the ocean too much, and young people not being able to make that link between, you know, engineering, okay, robotics. I don't have to go and work for Honda. Actually, I didn't know that, you know, AUV, subsurface autonomy was such a growing industry. I could go into that. So they're all interlinked, I think.
Thank you for that. And David Horrigan, who has posed a question very relevant to this, and that's that this is not just a question of an academic path. You know, there's plenty of scope and skills needed that could be facilitated through apprenticeships and through less. Most of the people working in our field tend to have come through an academic path, but that's not necessarily the way we're going to get the skills we need tomorrow. I'm conscious of the fact that we're getting to the end of our allotted time for this session. So sadly, I think I'm going to have to call proceedings to a close. I'm sure everyone in our audience agrees we've had a really interesting and thought-provoking debate about the challenge of delivering a sustainable ocean economy. In the time we've had allotted to this, we've only really been able to scratch the surface, but hopefully it's given everyone listening some food for thought. It remains for me to thank all of our panelists for their contribution, and most importantly, our audience for taking the time to listen and participate in this discussion. I'd like to leave you all with one parting thought. I'm sure everyone listening into this conversation is passionate about the ocean. I leave you all with the challenge of ensuring that you do everything you can to help smooth the transition to a vibrant ocean economy that ensures protection of the ocean environment and everything it does for us. Thank you very much.